Proof Positive by Greene. The tired voice went on. It seemed to surmount enormous obstacles to speech. The man's sick, Colonel Crashaw thought with pity and irritation. When a young man, he had climbed in the Himalayas, and he remembered how at great heights several breaths had to be taken for every step advanced. The 5-foot-high platform in the music rooms of the spa seemed to entail for the speaker some of the same effort. He should never have come out on such a raw afternoon, thought Colonel Crashaw, pouring out a glass of water and pushing it across the lecturer's table. The rooms were badly heated, and yellow fingers of winter fog felt for cracks in the many windows. There was little doubt that the speaker had lost all touch with his audience. It was scattered in patches about the hall, elderly ladies who made no attempt to hide their cruel boredom, and a few men, with the appearance of retired officers, who put up a show of attention. Colonel Crashaw, as president of the local psychical society, had received a note from the speaker a little more than a week ago, written by a hand which trembled with sickness, age, or drunkenness. It asked urgently for a special meeting of the society. An extraordinary, a really impressive experience was to be described while still fresh in the mind, though what the experience had been was left vague. Colonel Crashaw would have hesitated to comply if the note had not been signed by a Major Philip Weaver, Indian Army, retired. One had to do what one could for a brother officer. The trembling of the hand must be either age or sickness. It proved principally to be the latter when the two men met for the first time on the platform. Major Weaver was not more than 60, tall, thin, and dark, with an ugly, obstinate nose and satire in his eye, the most unlikely person to experience anything unexplainable. What antagonized Crashaw most was that Weaver used scent, a white handkerchief which drooped from his breast pocket, exhaled as rich and sweet in odor as a whole altar of lilies. Several ladies pricked their noses, and General Leadbiter asked loudly whether he might smoke. It was quite obvious that Weaver understood. He smiled provocatively and asked very slowly, "Would you mind not smoking? My throat has been bad for some time." Crashaw murmured that it was terrible weather. Influenza throats were common. The satirical eye came round to him and considered him thoughtfully, while Weaver said in a voice which carried halfway across the hall, "It's cancer in my case." In the shocked, vexed silence that followed the unnecessary intimacy, he began to speak without waiting for any introduction from Crashaw. He seemed at first to be in a hurry. It was only later that the terrible impediments were placed in the way of his speech. He had a high voice, which sometimes broke into a squeal, and must have been peculiarly disagreeable on the parade ground. He paid a few compliments to the local society. His remarks were just sufficiently exaggerated to be irritating. He was glad, he said, to give them the chance of hearing him. What he had to say might alter their whole view of the relative values of matter and spirit. Mystic stuff, thought Crashaw. Weaver's high voice began to shoot out hurried platitudes. The spirit, he said, was stronger than anyone realized. The physiological action of heart and brain and nerves were subordinate to the spirit. The spirit was everything. He said again, his voice squeaking up like bats into the ceiling, "The spirit is so much stronger than you think." He put his hand across his throat and squinted sideways at the window panes and the nuzzling fog, and upwards at the bare electric globe sizzling with heat and poor light in the dim afternoon. "It's immortal," he told them very seriously, and they shifted, restless, uncomfortable, and weary in their chairs. It was then that his voice grew tired and his speech impeded. The knowledge that he had entirely lost touch with his audience may have been the cause. An elderly lady at the back had taken her knitting from a bag. and her needles flashed along the walls where the light caught them, like a bright, ironic spirit. Satire for a moment deserted Weaver's eyes, and Crashaw saw the vacancy it left, as though the ball had turned to glass. "This is important," the lecturer cried to them. "I can tell you a story." His audience's attention was momentarily caught by this promise of something definite, but the stillness of the lady's needles did not soothe him. He sneered at them all. "Signs and wonders," he said. Then he lost the thread of his speech altogether. His hand passed to and fro across his throat, and he quoted Shakespeare, and then St. Paul's epistle to the Galatians. His speech, as it grew slower, seemed to lose all logical order, though now and then Crashaw was surprised by the shrewdness in the juxtaposition of two irrelevant ideas. It was like the conversation of an old man which flits from subject to subject, the thread a subconscious one. "When I was at Simla," he said, bending his brows as though to avoid the sun flash on the barrack square, but perhaps the frost, the fog, the tarnished room broke his memories. He began to assure the wearied faces all over again that the spirit did not die when the body died, but that the body only moved at the spirit's will. One had to be obstinate, to grapple. Pathetic, Crashaw thought, the sick man's clinging to his belief. It was as if life were an only son who was dying and with whom he wished to preserve some form of communication. A note was passed to Crashaw from the audience. It came from a Dr. Brown, a small, alert man in the third row. The society cherished him as the kind of pet skeptic. The note read, "Can't you make him stop? The man's obviously very ill. And what good is this talk anyway?" Crashaw turned his eyes sideways and upwards, and felt his pity vanish at the sight of the roving satirical eyes that gave the lie to the tongue, and at the small overpoweringly sweet of the scent in which Weaver had steeped his handkerchief. The man was an outsider. He would look up his army record in the old army lists when he got home. "Proof positive," Weaver was saying, sighing a shrill breath of exhaustion between the words. Crashaw laid his watch upon the table, but Weaver paid him no attention. He was supporting himself on the rim of the table with one hand. "I'll give you," he said, speaking with increasing difficulty, "proof pos—" His voice scraped in stillness, like a needle at a record's end, but the quiet did not last. From an expressionless face, a sound which was more like a high mew than anything else jerked the audience into attention. He followed it up, still without a trace of any emotion or understanding, with a succession of incomprehensible sounds, a low labial whispering, an odd jangling note, while his fingers tapped on the table. The sounds brought to mind innumerable seances, the bound medium, the tambourine shaken in mid-air, the whispered trivialities of loved ghosts in the darkness, the dinginess, the airless rooms. Weaver sat down slowly in his chair and let his head fall backwards. An old lady began to cry nervously, and Dr. Brown scrambled onto the platform and bent over him. Colonel Crashaw saw the doctor's hands tremble as he picked the handkerchief from the pocket and flung it away from him. Crashaw, aware of another and more unpleasant smell, heard Dr. Brown whisper, "Send them all away. He's dead." He spoke with a distress unusual in a doctor accustomed to every kind of death. Crashaw, before he complied, glanced over Dr. Brown's shoulder at the dead man. Major Weaver's appearance disquieted him. In a long life he had seen many forms of death, men shot by their own hand, and men killed in the field, but never such suggestion of mortality. The body might have been one fished from the sea a long while after death. The flesh of the face seemed as ready to fall as an overripe fruit. So it was with no great shock of surprise that he heard Dr. Brown's whispered statement, "The man must have been dead a week." What the Colonel thought of most was Weaver's claim, proof positive, proof he had probably meant that the spirit outlived the body, that it tasted eternity. But all he had certainly revealed was how, without the body's aid, the spirit in 7 days decayed into whispered nonsense. Graham Greene, 1930. Labial is relating to the lips, or requiring complete or partial closure of the lips. Mew.
Mew.
Make a characteristic high-pitched crying noise of a cat or some kinds of bird. Or the high-pitched crying noise of a cat or bird.